The sun was a merciless hammer beating down on the cracked red earth until the horizon shimmered with heat-born ghosts. For 3 days, Caleb Whitmore had watched those phantoms dance from the window of a cramped, rattling stagecoach. Now, standing on the edge of the territory, he understood that the ghosts were not just in the heat. They were in the silence, in the vast, aching emptiness of the land itself. He was hiding a coward crouched behind a cluster of sun-bleached boulders, his breath catching in his throat like a fist. Below him, on the dusty ribbon of road, the stagecoach lay on its side like a wounded animal. The horses screamed their terror, a sharp, piercing sound in the oppressive quiet. 4 men, their faces obscured by bandanas, worked with brutal efficiency. But it was their leader who held Caleb's gaze, a man who moved with an unnatural calm amid the chaos. He wore no mask. His face was sharp and handsome, framed by dark hair, and his clothes were too fine for the dirty work of a highwayman. He directed his men with quiet gestures, his voice a low, educated murmur that carried on the dry wind. The 2 guards, brave men who had tried to make a stand, lay still in the dust. The leader approached one of them, who was groaning, still clinging to life. He knelt, his posture almost gentle, and spoke words Caleb could not hear. Then, without a flicker of emotion, he drew a silver-plated revolver and fired once. The sound was flat final. He did the same for the other guard, a cold, methodical act of execution that turned the blood in Caleb's veins to ice. As the leader stood, something slipped from his vest pocket, a glint of silver falling unnoticed into the rust-colored dirt. His men finished looting the coach, hauling a heavy strongbox from its splintered remains. They mounted their horses and galloped away, swallowed by the shimmering heat from which they had emerged. Silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. Caleb waited, his body rigid with fear and a self-loathing so intense it was a physical sickness. He was no hero. He was a farmer, a man whose hands knew the feel of a plow, not a pistol. He had watched men die and done nothing. The guilt that was his constant companion tightened its grip of a familiar weight upon his soul. He forced himself to move his legs stiff as he stumbled down the rocky incline. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the lingering scent of gunpowder. He approached the spot where the leader had stood, his eyes scanning the ground. There, half buried in the dust, was the object, a small, intricately engraved silver locket. His fingers, clumsy and trembling, closed around it. It was cool against his hot skin. He pried it open. The world tilted. The sun, the sky, the dead men on the ground, it all dissolved into a roar in his ears. Inside the locket were 2 faded miniature portraits. On one side was a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. On the other, a little girl with bright, curious eyes and a ribbon in her hair. It was his wife Sarah and his daughter Lena. Caleb fell to his knees, the locket clutched in his fist. A wave of nausea and disbelief washed over him. Sarah and Lena were dead, taken from him 5 years ago in the fire that had consumed his farm, his life, his very soul. A fire he had always believed was his fault, a tragic accident born of his own carelessness. But this was impossible. How could this man, this cold-blooded killer, possess a picture of the family he had lost? The mystery was a shard of glass in his heart, twisting with every frantic beat. He was a man running from his past, seeking to bury his guilt under the dust of a new life. But in an instant, on a lonely stretch of road, his past had risen up not as a ghost, but as a man with a silver revolver and a locket full of stolen memories. The last of his money felt thin and brittle in his pocket, a handful of coins that represented the final ashes of his former life. Caleb Whitmore, once a farmer with calloused hands and a future rooted in the soil, was now a man adrift. His clothes were worn and the fabric frayed at the collars and cuffs, a testament to years of hard labor that had yielded only heartbreak. He clutched the deed to the Grand Morrison Hotel, the paper as dry and fragile as his hopes. He had bought it sight unseen, a massive abandoned structure on the edge of nowhere, for less than the price of a decent horse. The seller had been desperate, a fact that should have served as a warning. But desperation was a language Caleb understood all too well. As he rode his tired old mare Dusty toward his new property, his mind was a storm of memory and regret. The fire. It always came back to the fire. He saw the flames licking at the night sky, a ravenous orange beast devouring the dry timbers of his home. He heard Sarah's scream, a sound that had been torn from his memory and branded onto his soul. He remembered the suffocating smoke, the searing heat, and the paralyzing terror that had rooted him to the spot before a falling beam had knocked him unconscious. When he awoke, everything was gone. His wife, his daughter, his farm, his future. The sheriff had ruled it an accident, a stray ember from the hearth, a tragic mishap. But Caleb knew better. He had been the one who banked the fire that night, and in the dark recesses of his guilt, he had always carried the certainty that he had been careless, that his mistake had cost him everything. That guilt had been the bedrock of his existence for 5 years. Now the locket he kept hidden in his saddlebag challenged that foundation. It was a cold, hard piece of a puzzle he couldn't comprehend. The man from the robbery, the murderer, had a name. Sterling Rhodes. Caleb had learned it in the first dusty town he'd passed through, a name spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence. Rhodes was the most powerful landowner in the territory, a man who owned everything the sun touched. And he carried a picture of Caleb's dead family. The Grand Morrison Hotel rose from the plains like a skeletal monarch, its towers and gables stark against the endless blue sky. It was larger than he had imagined, a 3-story behemoth of faded paint and broken windows. It looked haunted not by spirits, but by the slow, relentless decay of time and neglect. Dust had been there so long, it moved like water when Caleb stepped into the lobby. Every surface was veiled in a thick gray powder. Every chair and table was draped in a white sheet, like a congregation of ghosts, frozen in silent prayer. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. Even his footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by the thick dust covering old carpets and wooden floors. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. This was his fresh start, this mausoleum of forgotten dreams. Behind the reception desk, a large guest registry lay open, its pages yellowed and brittle. The last entry was dated decades ago. But someone had been here more recently. He could see it clearly, fresh footprints in the dust, larger than his own, leading toward the back of the building. They stopped abruptly at a wall, covered by a faded, peeling painting of rolling green hills, a landscape so alien to this place it felt like a cruel joke. A piece of paper protruded from beneath the registry. Caleb pulled it free. It was a hand-drawn map of the hotel, meticulously detailed, marking every room, every corridor. But there was something wrong. The map showed a room in the basement, directly beneath the kitchen, that did not seem to exist on the building's foundation plans he had reviewed. A hidden space. The sound of approaching horses shattered the silence. Caleb's hand tightened on the map, his knuckles white. He shoved it into his pocket as 3 riders dismounted near the entrance. The man in front wore expensive clothes and carried himself with an air of absolute authority. His face was the one from the robbery, the one from Caleb's nightmares. Sterling Rhodes. Sterling pushed through the front doors without knocking, his polished boots clicking sharply on the wooden floor. Behind him came 2 younger men. One was lean and silent, his eyes constantly moving, taking in every detail of the room with a predator's watchfulness. The other was fidgety, his hand hovering nervously near the butt of his pistol. They spread out a practiced maneuver that sealed off any escape. Whitmore Sterling's voice was smooth-cultured, a stark contrast to the rugged world around them. It echoed in the vast, empty space. "I heard you bought this old place. An interesting choice for a man in your situation." Caleb kept his face a neutral mask, though his heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He stood taller, refusing to show the fear that threatened to consume him. "Just looking for a fresh start, Mr. Rhodes. Nothing wrong with that." Sterling began to walk slowly around the lobby, trailing a gloved finger along a dusty tabletop, leaving a clean, dark line in his wake. This building has quite a history. Built in the early days when this territory was wild and lawless. A lot of secrets in these walls. The silent man had drifted toward the back wall, his gaze fixed on the faded painting where the footprints ended. "I'm sure it does," Caleb replied, his own voice terse and guarded. "But that's all in the past now." Sterling stopped turning to face him. His eyes were cold, calculating, and held a glint of predatory curiosity. "The thing about the past, Whitmore, is that it has a way of catching up with the present, especially when someone starts digging where they shouldn't." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "I heard about the tragedy that befell your farm a few years back. A fire, wasn't it? Terrible business. One must be so careful with open flames in a dry climate." The casual, almost intimate mention of the fire sent a chill down Caleb's spine. It was not a question. It was a probe, a knife sliding between his ribs. Sterling was testing him, searching for a weakness. The silent man near the painting tapped the wall lightly with his knuckles. The sound was hollow, distinctly different from the solid thud of the walls elsewhere. A brief, almost imperceptible flash of satisfaction crossed Sterling's face. "Well," Sterling said, adjusting the brim of his hat, "I suppose we should let you get back to your exploration. Welcome to the territory, Whitmore." He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Just some friendly advice. Some doors are better left unopened." His men followed him out. They mounted their horses and rode away their departure, stirring up a cloud of dust that hung in the afternoon light. Caleb stood frozen in the lobby, the veiled threat echoing in the silence. Sterling hadn't come to welcome him. He had come to see if Caleb had found the map. And his unnerving questions about the fire confirmed the locket's terrifying message: this man was inextricably, violently linked to the tragedy that had destroyed Caleb's life. The fresh start he had so desperately sought had just become a battlefield, and the ghosts of his past were armed and waiting. That evening, by the flickering light of a single lantern, the hotel kitchen felt like the belly of a great, sleeping beast. Caleb sat at a sturdy wooden table, the mysterious map spread out before him. The hidden room it depicted, a perfect square beneath his very feet, seemed an architectural impossibility. Sterling's parting words, "Some doors are better left unopened," played over and over in his mind. The threat was clear, but it was the personal, probing nature of his questions that truly unsettled Caleb. He was examining the faded painting in the lobby when he noticed the floorboard. It was slightly raised, a detail the thick carpet of dust had nearly obscured. Prying it up with his knife, he found a small, hollow space. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the elegant looping script of a man named Jacob Morrison. As he began to read, a gentle knock sounded at the kitchen's back door. Caleb shoved the journal and map into his coat, his hand instinctively going to the small, hefty derringer he kept tucked in his belt, a precaution he'd taken since the stagecoach robbery. Through the grimy glass, he saw the silhouette of a woman. He opened the door cautiously. She was older, her face a roadmap of worry and resilience, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. Graying hair was pulled back in a simple bun. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice quiet but firm. I'm Nora Langley. I live just down the road. She didn't offer a basket of food or a warm welcome. Her presence felt more like an assessment. Ma'am, Caleb nodded, stepping aside to let her in. Nora entered the kitchen, her gaze sweeping over the room before settling on him. She seemed to be measuring his character, looking for something beyond the worn clothes and the weary expression on his face. Men like Sterling Rhodes don't pay social calls without a reason, she stated, her words devoid of pleasantry. He is a patient wolf, but his patience has a limit. Caleb stiffened. You know him. Everyone in this territory knows of him, she corrected. Some of us know what he is. My family has been watching this hotel and the Rhodes family for generations. They have wanted this land, this building, for a very long time. She paused, her eyes searching his. You are not what he expected. He expected a simple farmer, easily frightened. But there is a darkness in you, a grief. Men with nothing left to lose are unpredictable. That makes you dangerous to him. Her insight was so sharp, it felt like an intrusion. Caleb's hand moved unconsciously to the pocket, holding the locket. What is it that Rhodes wants here? Instead of answering directly, Nora walked to the center of the kitchen, her boots making soft sounds on the dusty floorboards. The man who built this hotel, my great-grandfather Jacob Morrison, was an honest man in a dishonest time. He learned that the very foundation of this territory was built on a lie, a massive land fraud scheme orchestrated by a consortium of powerful men. They were selling forged deeds, stealing land from honest settlers. Jacob gathered proof. Names, ledgers, original documents. Enough to send them all to the gallows. Caleb listened, his pulse quickening. The journal in his coat suddenly felt 10 pounds heavier. He built a place to hide that proof. Nora continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper as she tapped her foot on the floor. A secret room. Right here. He died before he could bring the evidence to light. His death was convenient for his enemies. Among them, Sterling Rhodes' ancestors. The pieces were beginning to fit together, forming a picture far more complex and dangerous than he could have imagined. The map, Caleb said, pulling it from his pocket. I found this. Nora nodded, a flicker of something, perhaps approval, in her eyes. And the journal. Caleb hesitated for only a moment before producing it as well. He was in over his head, and this woman with her cryptic warnings and ancient family secrets seemed to be his only potential ally. He was a meticulous man, Nora said, her fingers tracing the cover of the journal reverently. But he was also a cautious one. The journal is likely coded. The truth is in there, but you will have to earn it. Her words presented him with his first true obstacle. It wasn't just about finding a hidden room anymore. It was about deciphering the past, a past that was now tangled with his own. And to do that, he first had to earn the trust of this wary, tight-lipped woman who held the keys to her great-grandfather's secrets. Why are you telling me this? Caleb asked, his voice low. Why trust me? Nora looked at him, her expression unreadable. I'm not sure that I do. But my great-grandfather believed that one day the right person would come to this place. Someone with the strength to finish what he started. Sterling Rhodes believes you are a pawn he can sweep from the board. I am waiting to see if he is right, too. The nights that followed were a descent into a world of shadows and whispers. By the dim, sputtering light of a single lantern, Caleb and Nora huddled over Jacob Morrison's journal in the hotel's cavernous, cold kitchen. The building groaned around them, its ancient timbers settling every creak and sigh of the wind outside, sounding like the approach of Sterling's men. Jacob's journal was not a simple diary. It was a labyrinth of coded entries, numbers replacing names, and allegorical phrases describing complex financial transactions. At first, It was impenetrable. But Nora, who had grown up with the folklore of her great-grandfather's fight, held the key. He loved literature, she explained one night, her finger tracing a recurring phrase. The serpent in the garden. That was his name for the territorial governor. The 30 pieces of silver. That referred to the standard bribe paid to the land office clerk. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to unravel the conspiracy. The journal detailed a breathtakingly audacious land fraud scheme. A powerful consortium led by the ancestors of Sterling Rhodes and other prominent families had conspired with corrupt government officials to issue duplicate land titles. One was given to a hard-working settler. The other, the true legally binding deed, was sold to wealthy investors back east. When the time was right, the investors would appear their claim ironclad, and the settlers would be evicted from the land they had bled and sweat for left, with nothing but a worthless piece of paper. As they worked, a quiet alliance formed between them. Caleb saw in Nora a fierce, unyielding resolve, a lifetime of waiting for this moment. Nora, in turn, began to see past Caleb's grief-hardened exterior to the determined man beneath. She tested him not with questions, but with silences, watching how he reacted to the mounting pressure. That pressure came swiftly. Sterling Rhodes was not a man to wait patiently. One morning, Caleb found the hotel's well fouled with the bloated carcass of a coyote, their only source of fresh water for miles, poisoned. A few days later, his horse Dusty was spooked in the night her tethers cut. He spent a full day tracking the terrified animal across the plains. These were not direct threats, but calculated acts of intimidation designed to wear him down, to make him feel isolated and vulnerable. They forced Caleb and Nora to work with even greater secrecy their late-night sessions, fueled by stale coffee and a growing sense of urgency. Then one night, they found it. A passage in the journal different from the others, written in plain, uncoded English. It was a direct address to the future, a final testament. To whomever finds this record. Jacob had written, "Know that the evil I have fought is a cancer on this land. The Rhodes family, the Abernathys, the Wainwrights, they are thieves of the highest order. But I was not alone in my desire to see justice done. I had found an ally, a junior partner in their wicked enterprise, who grew a conscience. His name is..." Caleb's breath caught in his throat as he read the next words. William Whitmore. The name struck him like a physical blow. William Whitmore. His father. He reread the line, his mind refusing to process the information. His father, a man he remembered as a stern but honorable merchant, who had died of a fever when Caleb was just a boy, had been a part of this criminal conspiracy. It can't be. Caleb whispered the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. The image he held of his father, a respectable, hard-working man, shattered into 1,000 pieces. Nora placed a gentle hand on his arm. Her eyes were filled not with judgment, but with a deep, sorrowful understanding. "Keep reading, Caleb." He forced his eyes back to the page, his hands trembling. "For William came to me in secret." The entry continued, his soul tormented by his complicity. He provided me with inside knowledge, names, and details that solidified my case. He was afraid, and rightly so, for these are not men who tolerate betrayal. But he pledged to stand with me, to testify, to expose the entire rotten affair and atone for his part in it. He is a good man who made a terrible mistake and is now risking everything to make it right. The revelation struck Caleb with the force of a physical impact. His family's history, the very story of who he was a lie. His father was not just a simple merchant. He was a man caught between crime and conscience, a whistleblower in the making. The shock was profound, planting a seed of doubt not only about his father, but about everything he thought he knew. Sterling Rhodes' interest in him in the hotel was no longer just about a decades-old crime. It was personal. The feud between their families was older and deeper than he could ever have fathomed. The discovery that his father was connected to the conspiracy had changed everything. It transformed Caleb's quest from a simple matter of survival into a deeply personal excavation of his own past. Armed with this new unsettling knowledge, he and Nora followed the final clues in Jacob's journal, which led them not to the hollow wall in the lobby, but back down to the dark, musty storage cellar. Behind a heavy wooden shelving unit, they found the narrow opening in the stone foundation, just as Jacob's notes described. Cool, stale air flowed from the passage, a breath from a sealed tomb. They squeezed through the rough stone, scraping against their clothes, and emerged into a small, man-made chamber. And there it was. Dominating the far wall stood a massive iron safe, a fortress of rivets and gears, its dark metal surface a monument to the secrets it had guarded for decades. It was not alone. Beside the safe sat a small iron-banded chest secured with a heavy, ornate lock. As Nora moved closer, her lantern light fell upon the lock, and she let out a soft gasp. Dangling from a thin leather cord around her neck was an old tarnished silver key. She had worn it her entire life, a family heirloom passed down from her mother, who had told her it was simply a keepsake from her great-grandfather Jacob. She had never known what it was for. With trembling hands, Nora inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying, resonant click. She lifted the heavy lid. The chest was not filled with gold or valuables. It was filled with letters tied in neat bundles with faded ribbon. They were addressed to William Whitmore, Caleb's father. He reached for the top bundle, his fingers numb. The letters were from Jacob Morrison. He read the first one, his heart pounding in the silent chamber. It was a plea, a carefully worded appeal to his father's conscience, urging him to abandon his partners and help expose the fraud. The subsequent letters grew more urgent, detailing the lives that were being ruined, the families being cast into poverty. Finally, he reached the last letter. The paper was crisp, the ink dark and bold, written with the urgency of a man on the precipice of a momentous decision. William. It read, "Your agreement to come forward has given me the strength to see this through. Your testimony will be the final nail in their coffin. Meet me at the federal courthouse in the territorial capital in 2 days' time. Together, we will give this territory back to the honest folk it was meant for. The truth will finally see the light of day. May God give us both the courage to face what is to come." Caleb's eyes fell to the date at the bottom of the page. It was the day before the fire. The world seemed to stop. The musty air in the chamber grew thin, impossible to breathe. The carefully constructed narrative of his life, the 5 years of soul-crushing guilt, crumbled into dust. The fire wasn't an accident. It wasn't his fault. The stray ember, his carelessness, it was all a lie he had told himself to make sense of a senseless tragedy. It was an assassination. They hadn't just come for his father. They had come to silence him, to burn the evidence he might have possessed, and in their ruthless calculus, his wife and child had been deemed acceptable losses. The grief that had defined him for so long did not vanish. It transmuted hardening from a dull, passive ache into a white-hot spear of righteous fury. The weight of his guilt was lifted, only to be replaced by a heavier, more terrible burden, the call for justice. He finally understood. Sterling Rhodes wasn't just trying to protect his family's legacy. He was trying to bury the truth of a murder that had made Caleb the man he was today. The revelation in the cellar ignited a fire in Caleb, but it was a cold, controlled burn. His quest was no longer for a fresh start. It was for an ending. an ending for Sterling Rhodes and the corrupt dynasty his family had built on lies and blood. But Sterling, sensing the shift in the game, dropped all pretense of civility. The time for veiled threats and petty intimidation was over. He moved with the swift, brutal precision of a chess master sweeping the board. He did not send thugs in the night. He used a far more insidious weapon, his influence. Within a day, whispers started in the nearby town of Redemption, a town whose prosperity was intrinsically linked to the Rhodes family estate. The whispers painted Caleb as a swindler, a card cheat, a horse thief. Shopkeepers who had once nodded politely now turned their backs. The friendly blacksmith suddenly had no time to re-shoe Dusty. The campaign culminated when Sheriff Brody, a man whose loyalty to Sterling was an open secret, pinned a wanted poster to the town's message board. It featured a crude, unflattering sketch of Caleb's face. The charge was horse theft, a crime punishable by hanging. A warrant was issued for his arrest. Caleb became a fugitive overnight. Nora, her face etched with grim determination, brought him the news just as he was preparing to study the complex dual combination lock on the safe. "He's turned the whole town against you," she said, her voice low and urgent. "You can't stay here. They'll form a posse before morning." He was forced to flee, leaving the hotel and its secrets behind. He took only what he could carry: some food, a water skin, and the crumpled piece of paper on which he had hastily copied the names from the safe's dual dials, Nora and Lena. He retreated into the harsh, unforgiving wilderness of the Badlands, a maze of canyons and mesas, where the sun baked the life from the very stones. The wilderness became his sanctuary and his prison. By day he hid from the sun and the occasional riders silhouetted against the skyline. By night he moved a ghost in the moonlight, wrestling with the puzzle of the safe. He knew the names, but Jacob Morrison, a man obsessed with codes and hidden meanings, would not have made it that simple. It had to be more than just spelling them out. Days bled into a week. His food ran out. His water grew scarce. The loneliness was a physical weight, pressing in on him from all sides. He was completely isolated, hunted by the law and haunted by the past. The rage that had sustained him began to give way to a cold knot of desperation. Sterling had successfully cut him off from everything, from Nora, from the hotel, from the very evidence that could prove his innocence and expose the truth. During one long, thirsty night, huddled in a shallow cave, as a cold wind howled through the canyons, he stared at the names scrawled on the paper. Nora, Lena. Two women from two different families, two different generations, linked by a tragedy. Jacob had chosen them for a reason. His mind, sharpened by hunger and desperation, began to see not just letters, but patterns. Numbers. The old alphabet code they had used for the first lock. NORA was 14, 15, 18, 1. LINA was 12, 9, 14, 1. But that was too simple. Jacob's mind was more complex. Caleb remembered a detail from the journal, a passing mention of Jacob's fascination with numerology and the significance of sums. He added the numbers. Nora, 14 plus 15 plus 18 plus 1, 48. Lena, 12 plus 9 plus 1, 36. Two numbers, 48 and 36. Was this the combination, or just another layer of the puzzle? There was only one way to find out. He knew he couldn't survive in the wilderness forever. His final stand had to be at the hotel. It was an act of pure desperation, a final defiant move against a man who had taken everything from him. He had to get back to that cellar, to that safe. It was his only path to justice, even if it led him straight into Sterling's trap. Under the sliver of a new moon, the Grand Morrison Hotel was a black silhouette against a sea of stars. Caleb moved through the darkness, like a phantom, his senses honed by a week of living on the edge. He had circled the property for hours, waiting, confirming that Sterling had left only 2 guards, and the jumpy one and the silent one from his first visit. They were confident, careless, believing their fugitive was either dead in the Badlands or miles away. Nora was waiting for him at the prearranged spot behind the stables, a grim shadow in the deeper shadows. She had been his eyes and ears, risking her own safety to track the guards' routines. "They play cards in the lobby until midnight," she whispered, pressing a heavy Colt revolver into his hand. "Then one sleeps, while the other watches the front. You have to be inside before then." Their plan was desperate. Nora would create a diversion, a fire in a derelict shed on the far side of the property to draw the guards away. It would buy Caleb only a few precious minutes. He slipped into the hotel through the kitchen door he had left unlocked. The silence inside was familiar, but now it felt charged with tension. He made his way to the cellar, every creak of the floorboards, a cannon shot in the stillness. He squeezed through the hidden passage and stood before the great iron safe, his heart hammering against his ribs. Outside, a faint orange glow flickered against the cellar's high, narrow windows, followed by a distant shout. Nora's diversion. Time was running out. His hands, slick with sweat, moved to the dials. He had to work 2 combinations simultaneously, one with each hand. His left hand spun the dials for the top lock, 4-8. His right hand worked the bottom, 3-6. He entered the final number and pulled the heavy iron handle. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. He pulled again, putting all his weight into it. With a deep, groaning sound of metal on metal, the massive door swung open. The beam of his lantern fell upon stacks of leather-bound ledgers, official-looking documents tied with ribbon and deeds stamped with government seals. It was all there. The proof. The truth. A floorboard creaked above him. Caleb spun around, raising his revolver, just as Sterling Rhodes stepped into the lantern light at the entrance to the chamber. He was not alone. He held Nora firmly in front of him, the cold silver barrel of his pistol pressed against her temple. The silent guard stood behind them, his own weapon drawn. The fire had been a trap. Sterling had anticipated his move. "I knew you couldn't stay away." Whitmore, Sterling said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "A man with nothing to lose is always predictable." He gestured with his gun toward the open safe. "After all these years, my family searched for this for generations, and a broke farmer stumbles right into it. There's a certain poetry to that, don't you think?" "Let her go, Rhodes," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. The chamber felt impossibly small, a stone box closing in on them. Sterling smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. "Oh, I will. After you've helped me load these documents into a canvas sack so we can have a nice, respectable bonfire." He saw the fury in Caleb's eyes, and his smile widened. "You think this is about money, don't you? About protecting my family's name from scandal?" He shook his head slowly. "You have it all wrong. You see, my family wasn't part of the conspiracy. We were its first victims." The words hung in the air, nonsensical, impossible. "What are you talking about?" Caleb demanded. "Before your father and his partners perfected their scheme, they needed to test it." Sterling explained, his voice taking on the quality of a man recounting a painful memorized story. "They needed a trial run. My grandfather was a wealthy man, an idealist who believed in the promise of this new territory. He bought thousands of acres, the foundation of our estate, with a deed signed and sealed by the territorial governor himself. It was all a fraud. Your father and his partners used my family to learn how to create the perfect forgery. When they were done, they swooped in with a legitimate title and took everything. They ruined us. My grandfather lost his mind. My father spent his entire life trying to reclaim our honor, our name dying a bitter, broken man. The world tilted under Caleb's feet. This man, his nemesis, the architect of his recent misery, was claiming to be a victim of his own father's crimes. The fire. Caleb breathed the words barely audible. Yes, the fire. Sterling's voice turned hard as flint. I was young, full of rage. I wanted revenge. Not on you, not on your family. On him. William Whitmore. The man who destroyed my life before it even began. I just wanted to burn his house down, to make him feel a fraction of the loss my family had endured. I never knew. I swear I never knew your mother and sister were inside. He reached into his vest and pulled out a silver locket. It was identical to the one Caleb had found. Sterling opened it. My family was destroyed by that feud just as surely as yours was. I lost my wife to sickness because we couldn't afford proper doctors. I lost my children to the East because I couldn't bear for them to grow up under the shadow of our family's shame. He looked at Caleb, and for the first time, Caleb saw not a villain, but a man hollowed out by grief, a mirror image of himself. I don't want the documents for wealth. I want to burn them. I want to erase the last record of my family's humiliation, to finally bury the legacy of the men who wronged us both. The climax was no longer a battle between good and evil. It was a collision of two broken men, both sons paying for the sins of their fathers, both victims of the same sprawling tragedy. The safe stood open between them, not a treasure chest, but a Pandora's box, and the truths it had unleashed were more terrible than either of them could have ever imagined. In the suffocating silence of the stone chamber, the truth settled like a shroud. The gun in Sterling's hand did not waver, but the certainty in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, ancient pain. Caleb saw the path of his own life, reflected in the man before him, a life consumed by a past he couldn't escape. He saw the rage, the grief, and the desperate, futile quest for an ending that could never truly come. The choice was his. He could pull the trigger, perpetuating the cycle of revenge that had already consumed 2 generations. Or he could end it. Here. Now. Slowly, deliberately, Caleb lowered his revolver, placing it on top of a dusty crate. No more, he said, his voice quiet but firm, echoing in the small space. It ends with us. Sterling stared at him, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. In that moment of hesitation, Nora acted. She stomped down hard on Sterling's instep with her heel. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all Caleb needed. He lunged forward, not at Sterling, but at his gun hand, grabbing his wrist and twisting it upward. The pistol fired the shot, deafening in the enclosed room, the bullet ricocheting harmlessly off the stone ceiling. The silent guard moved to intervene, but a new voice cut through the ringing in their ears. Drop it. Sheriff Brody stood in the passage entrance, his shotgun leveled. But he wasn't looking at Caleb. His eyes were fixed on Sterling and his man. For the first time, Caleb saw not a corrupt lackey, but a man who had finally found himself on the wrong side of a power shift and was making a desperate calculation to save himself. Seeing Sterling disarmed and the undeniable proof of the conspiracy laid bare in the open safe, Brody knew the game was over. Sterling's power was broken. He chose his side. Sterling's man dropped his gun, and in the ensuing struggle, Caleb subdued Sterling without throwing another punch. He simply held him 2 exhausted men bound by a shared history of loss. Later, as a federal marshal summoned by a repentant Sheriff Brody supervised the removal of the documents, Caleb stood alone in the chamber. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a profound, hollowing sadness. He picked up one of the ledgers, On the first page in his father's familiar hand was the signature of William Whitmore, a willing participant in a crime. And tucked into the back was Jacob Morrison's final letter, the mark of a man who had found the courage to atone. His father was both a sinner and a saint, a thief and a hero. Caleb handed the ledger to the marshal, knowing that justice would finally be done, but that it would forever tarnish the simple, honorable memory of the father he thought he knew. Months later, the Grand Morrison Hotel was a beacon of life on the plains. The crumbling ruin gleamed with fresh paint and new glass, its lamps casting a warm, welcoming glow into the twilight. Stagecoaches were once again a regular sight, and the dining room, once thick with the dust of ages, was now filled with the clatter of silverware and the murmur of conversation. It was a symbol of rebirth for the territory, as much as for Caleb. The investigation sparked by Jacob Morrison's documents had been a cleansing fire. The corruption network was dismantled, the guilty were imprisoned, and the territorial government was forced to reform. A compensation fund was established for the countless families who had been victims of the land fraud, their claims validated by the very records that had been used to swindle them. Caleb, using his own share of a substantial reward, anonymously established a trust. It was a small one managed by a lawyer back east with a single purpose to provide for the education and welfare of Sterling Road's children. It was not an act of pity, but one of understanding, an attempt to ensure the next generation would be free of the shadows that had consumed their fathers. He had found a fragile peace, not in revenge, but in acceptance, and a quiet, difficult act of forgiveness. One evening, Caleb stood in the hotel lobby, now restored to its former grandeur. He looked at the grand fireplace, and on its polished oak mantel he placed two items side by side. One was the silver locket Sterling had dropped, the one containing the portraits of his wife and children. Next to it, he set a small framed photograph of his own father, William. He touched both objects, gently acknowledging the complex, intertwined history of pain and blood that connected them. The ghosts of the past were not gone, but they no longer haunted him. He had finally broken free. The stagecoach brought the evening mail. Among the letters was one for him with no return address, postmarked from a town far to the west. He recognized the elegant, steady handwriting at once. It was from Nora. She had moved on, seeking her own quiet peace after the storm had passed. Caleb, the letter began. I imagine you are well, and that the hotel is thriving. I have something to confess. When you first showed me your father's name in my great-grandfather's journal, I was not as surprised as I let on. I had found those letters in the locked chest years ago. I knew the whole story. I knew your father was both a conspirator and the man who was going to expose it all. I knew the fire was no accident. I did not tell you because this was a truth you could not be given. You had to uncover it for yourself. The guilt you carried was a prison, Caleb, but it was also a shield. Only by dismantling it, piece by piece, by confronting the full, complicated truth of your father and of Sterling Roads, could you truly heal. You had to walk that path alone to find your way out. I hope you understand. Be well, my friend. Find your peace. Nora. Caleb folded the letter, a slow smile touching his lips. He looked back at the mantel, at the two portraits representing two fathers, two legacies of sin and redemption. Nora was right. The difficult truth had been the only path. The silence in the hotel was no longer heavy and oppressive. It was calm. It was peaceful. It was the sound of a new beginning.